There is a particular kind of silence that follows catastrophe in New York City. Not the silence of peace, but the held breath silence of several thousand people waiting to find out if they're still alive. Spider-Man knew that silence well. He'd swung through the aftermath of Chitauri invasions, symbiote outbreaks, and Doom's mechanical nightmares. He knew the specific texture of disaster the way a surgeon knows scar tissue. This silence was different. It lasted exactly 1 second. Then the screaming started. But not the screaming of pain or terror, the screaming of confusion, the screaming of people who had been bracing for death and received instead a punchline they didn't understand. Midtown Manhattan, 2:47 p.m. Hydra had deployed a new variant of their dreadnought units. 12 of them, each standing 4 stories tall, was each carrying enough firepower to level a city block. All of them marching down Fifth Avenue while Baron Zemo watched from a rooftop with the self-satisfied expression of a man who has already won. The Avengers were 7 minutes out. Spider-Man was buying time, webbing gun barrels and yanking power cables, doing what he did, making it look harder than it was so nobody noticed how scared he actually was. He did not notice the man in the yellow boots land in the street below. He was unremarkable in every possible sense. Medium height, ordinary build, a white cape that had seen better days flapping in the urban wind, a face so blank it bordered on philosophical, not the calm of a warrior centered before battle, but the mild detachment of a man checking whether the grocery store was open. So he looked at the 12 four-story death machines stomping toward him and tilted his head slightly, the way a person does when they found an unexpected item in their shopping cart. The first dreadnought raised its cannon. The man sighed, a small, private sound, barely audible, and stepped forward. What happened next was technically one punch. The physics of it, however, were considerably more complicated. The shock waves shattered every window within 3 blocks. The sound arrived half a second after the visual, a crack so sharp it registered on seismographs in New Jersey. All 12 dreadnoughts, 4 stories each, armored in Hydra's finest vibranium alloy, built to withstand Thor's hammer, ceased to exist as functioning machines simultaneously. Not destroyed dramatically, not exploded cinematically, simply stopped, all folded into themselves like aluminum cans. On his rooftop, Baron Zemo stared at his tactical display, then at the street, then at his tactical display again. Spider-Man hung from a lamppost 40 feet up and said very quietly, "What?" The man in the yellow boots surveyed the wreckage. His expression didn't change. If anything, it dimmed. The particular dimming of someone who had hoped, briefly, and been disappointed again. He bent down and picked up a broken piece of dreadnought plating, examined it, set it back down. Around him, New Yorkers began to emerge from doorways and overturned taxis, filming on their phones with the dogged determination of a species that has decided that if something incredible happens and it isn't documented, it may as well not have occurred. "Hey!" Spider-Man dropped from the lamppost, might landed 10 feet from the man. "Hey, are you okay? Did you just, with one?" "Yeah," the man said. "One punch." "Yeah." Spider-Man looked at the ruins of 12 dreadnoughts. He looked at the man. He looked at the ruins again. "Who are you?" The man appeared to consider whether answering was worth the energy. "Saitama," he said finally. "Saitama," Spider-Man repeated. "Okay. And you just, it's always one punch," Saitama said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite sadness and not quite boredom, and was somehow worse than either. "It's always just one punch." Above them, the Quinjet arrived. 7 minutes late, exactly on schedule. Iron Man's repulsors flared as he descended, armor scanning the scene, processing the debris field, as trying to make sense of a threat response that had concluded before SHIELD had even dispatched. Captain America jumped from the hatch and landed in a crouch, shield ready, eyes moving with the trained efficiency of a man who has survived things that should have killed him. He looked at the dreadnoughts. He looked at the man in the yellow boots. He did not lower his shield. "Tony," he said quietly into the comm, "you seeing this?" "Yep," Iron Man said, hovering 30 feet above. "Friday can't identify him. No biometrics on record. No power signature she recognizes. And the debris pattern, a pause. Cap, the debris pattern is wrong for an explosion. The impact vectors are all wrong. It's like they were hit by something that doesn't have a physics category yet. On the street below, Saitama had found a convenience store that was still standing. He was looking at a display of discounted instant noodles in the window, with considerably more interest than he had shown the dreadnoughts. Spider-Man sidled up beside him. "So," he said, "the Avengers are right behind me, and they're going to have a lot of questions. Is that store open?" Saitama asked. What? "The store," he pointed. "Is it open? I haven't eaten since this morning, and I came here through a dimensional rift or something, and I don't know where I am, and also I'm a little hungry." Spider-Man stared at him for a long moment. Behind them, Iron Man landed. Captain America approached. Thor descended from the sky with a crack of thunder, Mjolnir in hand, golden hair catching the afternoon light, looking exactly as mythologically significant as he always did. Saitama glanced at Thor, the way most people glance at a mildly interesting cloud formation. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The store, as it turned out, was open. The convenience store was called Sal's, and Sal himself was behind the counter. A 63-year-old man from Queens who had survived 2 alien invasions, 1 symbiote outbreak, and a very confusing Tuesday involving a man made entirely of sand. He watched Saitama place 3 packets of instant noodles, a canned coffee, and a bag of shrimp crackers on the counter, with the quiet dignity of someone conducting important business. "You gonna pay for those?" Sal asked. Saitama checked his pockets. He found a Japanese yen coin, a receipt from a grocery store that no longer existed in this dimension, and what appeared to be a small piece of a robot. "I don't have American money," he said. "Then you don't got noodles," Sal said. Outside through the cracked window, Iron Man's armor reflected the afternoon sun in strips of red and gold. Captain America stood in the street with the measured patience of a man who has learned that patience is itself a weapon. Thor had landed and was staring at the ruins of the dreadnoughts with an expression caught between professional assessment and something that looked uncomfortably like unease. Spider-Man appeared in the doorway of Sal's. "Hey, Mr. Saitama, sir. The Avengers are... Sal, can we get these on my tab?" "You don't have a tab, Spider-Man." "I could have a tab. And this could be the beginning of a tab." Sal looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man conducting a private conversation with whatever deity had assigned him this particular life. "Fine," he said. "Tab." Saitama ate his noodles on the curb outside, dry, straight from the packet, with the focused attention of a man for whom this was genuinely the most interesting thing that had happened all day, which Spider-Man was beginning to understand might actually be true. Iron Man landed 10 feet away. The armor's faceplate slid up to reveal Tony Stark's face. That particular expression he wore when encountering something his models hadn't predicted, which was rarer than he liked to admit, and more frequent than he would ever acknowledge. "Friday," he said quietly. "What are we looking at?" "Unknown, boss. Biometrics suggest baseline human. No gamma radiation, no cosmic energy signature, no detectable enhancement. But the impact force required to produce the observed debris pattern would need to exceed a pause that, for an AI, was practically geological in length. I can't complete that calculation. The number doesn't have a category." "Baseline human," Tony repeated. "That's what the sensors say." Tony looked at Saitama eating crackers on the curb. Saitama looked back at Tony with mild, uncomplicated eyes. "Hi," Saitama said. "Hi," Tony said. "You just destroyed 12 Hydra dreadnoughts." "Yeah." "With one punch." "Yeah." Each one was rated to withstand a direct strike from Thor's hammer. Saitama considered this, crunching a cracker. He said with the energy of a man receiving mildly interesting trivia. Captain America approached and crouched to eye level. A deliberate choice, the kind of body language calibration that Steve Rogers did instinctively, positioning himself as a conversation rather than a confrontation. "I'm Steve Rogers," he said. "Can you tell us where you're from? How you got here?" Saitama thought about it. The story, as he explained it between crackers, was not complicated. He had been standing in his apartment. There had been a noise like reality reconsidering a decision. There had been a flash of light, and then he had been in the sky above this city and falling, and below him there had been large robots hurting people. And so he had dealt with that. It was, he explained, what he did. He was a hero. A hero, Steve said. For fun, Saitama said. Steve processed this. For fun. I used to work a regular job. Now I'm a hero. It's a hobby. He paused. It doesn't feel like a hobby anymore, though. It used to be exciting. Thor had approached during this exchange, and now stood with his arms crossed, Mjolnir resting at his side, studying Saitama with the focused attention of someone who has just heard a melody they almost recognize. Of all the Avengers, Thor alone had spent centuries cataloging the various textures of power, the specific weight of gods, the particular warmth of cosmic energy, the cold depth of ancient magic. He had stood in the presence of Odin and felt the pressure of it like standing at the bottom of an ocean. Standing near Saitama felt like nothing. No pressure, no energy, no signature whatsoever, which was, Thor was realizing, deeply wrong in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. You say you are a hero, Thor said. His voice carried its usual resonance, the unconscious authority of a man raised in divine halls. From whence do you hail? What pantheon claims you? What enchantment grants you this strength? Saitama looked up at Thor. He took in the cape, the hammer, the hair, the jaw that seemed architecturally overqualified for its function. No enchantment, he said. I trained 3 years, 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, 10 kilometers running every day. He paused. No air conditioning. The silence that followed was significant. Tony Stark, a man who had built a powered suit of armor in a cave and considered it a slow Tuesday, opened his mouth and closed it again. Spider-Man, hanging upside down from a lamppost, made a sound that was not quite a word. And Thor stared at Saitama for a long moment with an expression his face wasn't entirely equipped to produce. You are, he said slowly, telling me that you did push-ups. And lost my hair, Saitama said, tapping his head. Side effect. Thor looked at Mjolnir. He looked at Saitama. He looked at the ruins of the dreadnought stretched across Fifth Avenue, like the world's worst modern art installation. Something shifted behind his eyes. A quiet reckoning, the beginning of a question he wasn't sure he was ready to finish asking. I would know more of this training, Thor said, and his voice was very carefully controlled. And I would know its limits. Saitama shrugged. I haven't found any, he said simply. That's kind of the problem. The gym that Thor chose was not a gym in any conventional sense. It was a SHIELD, an evaluation facility buried 4 levels beneath a parking structure in Brooklyn. A vast, reinforced space designed to test enhanced individuals without destroying the surrounding borough. The walls were 12 feet of specialized alloy. The floor was rated for impacts that would register on the Richter scale. Nick Fury had approved its construction after the 3rd time a superhero evaluation had accidentally demolished a city block. It had never been tested against anything like this. The Avengers stood along the observation wall. Tony behind his readout screens, Steve with his arms folded and his face doing the careful thing it did when he was worried, but didn't want to project worry. Spider-Man sitting cross-legged on top of a console he probably shouldn't have been sitting on. Banner was there too, quiet in the corner, watching with the specific attention of a scientist observing a phenomenon that rearranges the furniture of everything he thought he understood. He had not brought the other guy. He was reconsidering that decision moment by moment. In the center of the floor, Thor stood across from Saitama and rolled his shoulders with the easy confidence of a man who has fought frost giants before breakfast and considered it light cardio. I propose a simple test, Thor said. Not combat, a measure of strength only. You will strike me, I will strike you. We will learn something true about each other. Saitama looked around the facility with mild curiosity. Will it damage this place? It is built to withstand considerable force. Okay, Saitama considered. Do you want me to hold back? The question landed in the room with the weight of something much larger than its words. Tony's screens flickered as Friday processed the query and found no satisfactory analytical framework. Steve's jaw tightened slightly. Banner pressed his lips together and wrote something in his notebook that he then crossed out. Thor, to his credit, did not flinch. He had stood before the World Serpent. He had faced Surtur's flame. He did not flinch. But something moved behind his eyes. That same almost recognition from the street, sharper now. "Give me what you would give a worthy opponent," he said carefully. "Okay," Saitama said again, "but tell me when you've had enough." Thor swung first. Mjolnir described a golden arc through the reinforced air, trailing lightning the color of a storm that means it. Iran connected with Saitama's raised forearm with a sound like the world's largest bell being struck by the world's largest hammer. The shock wave cracked the floor in a perfect circle around them. Two of Tony's screens went dark from vibration alone. Spider-Man's web grip on the console slipped, and he caught himself on the ceiling instead. Saitama looked at his forearm, then at Thor. His expression was the precise expression of a man who has been lightly tapped on the shoulder to get his attention. "Okay," he said, not unkindly. "My turn." He did not use a full punch. Even watching it, understanding what they were seeing only in retrospect, none of the Avengers could fully account for the speed. What Friday's sensors recorded was a strike delivered at approximately 40% force. Saitama's own estimate later. Ace offered with the mild precision of someone guessing at a cooking measurement that connected with Thor's midsection and sent the God of Thunder across the full length of the facility. Thor hit the reinforced wall. The wall held. Thor did not go through it. This was, Tony would note quietly, the single most impressive thing the wall had ever accomplished. There was a long silence. Thor peeled himself from the wall with the slow dignity of a man who is absolutely fine and simply taking his time getting up. He stood. He assessed himself with the thorough internal catalog of a warrior who has learned to conduct damage reports before Pride. Several ribs, possibly more. The kind of pain that, for an Asgardian, meant something had genuinely occurred. He began to laugh. It started small and grew into the full-chested thunder of genuine, a delighted awe, the laugh of a man who has searched for a worthy fight his entire very long life and has just received, from the least assuming source imaginable, the first real answer. He walked back across the cracked floor and clapped Saitama on the shoulder with a hand that could bend steel. "Brother," he said, and the word carried the full weight of Asgardian recognition. The term Thor reserved for equals, for those who had earned standing in the warrior's accounting. "I have fought gods and monsters across 9 realms in the space between stars. I have never been struck thus by a man who looked as though he was doing me a favor." Saitama rubbed the back of his head. "Sorry, was that too hard?" "It was perfect," Thor said, still grinning through what were definitely broken ribs. It was honest. Along the observation wall, for the rest of the room processed what they had just witnessed in their various ways. Tony was already running 17 simultaneous analyses and finding that they all arrived at the same impossible answer. Steve had uncrossed his arms and was looking at Saitama with a particular expression he reserved for phenomena that genuinely altered his understanding of possibility. Spider-Man had descended from the ceiling and was standing with his mouth open behind his mask in a way that was technically invisible, but somehow obvious. Banner had stopped writing. He was simply watching Saitama with the quiet, devastated recognition of a man who has spent his entire adult life tormented by the power he carries. The weight of something he never asked for and cannot put down. Watching someone else carry infinite power with the bored serenity of a man waiting for a bus. "Tony," Steve said quietly. "Yeah," Tony said. "We have a problem." "We have several," Tony said. "But surprisingly, I don't think he's one of them." He looked at Saitama, who had found a protein bar in his pocket and was reading the nutritional information with genuine interest. "He's not aggressive. He's not territorial. He's not trying to establish dominance or extract anything." A pause. "He's just bored." "A bored, omnipotent entity," Steve said. "In our universe," Tony confirmed. "That's not a problem?" Tony watched Saitama turn the protein bar over, decide against it, tour and put it back in his pocket. "It's the most interesting problem I've ever had," he said, "which is saying something, Because I once had to defuse a bomb while arguing with a time traveler. He closed his screens. Get Fury on the line and tell him to skip the part where he acts like he saw this coming. Nick Fury had, in his considerable experience, developed a reliable internal system for categorizing threats. It was not a formal system. It lived nowhere in any SHIELD database. It existed entirely in the space behind his one good eye and expressed itself in the specific way he held a cup of coffee, loosely when things were manageable, with both hands when they weren't. He was holding his coffee with both hands. The briefing room aboard the helicarrier was cold, the way rooms get cold when too many serious people occupy them simultaneously. Fury stood at the head of the table. Maria Hill sat to his left with a tablet displaying everything SHIELD had compiled on Saitama in the 4 hours since his arrival, which was both extensive and profoundly useless. Tony sat across from her, running his own analysis. Steve was present in the way Steve was always present, completely, attentively, like a man who understands that listening is itself a form of action. Saitama was not in the room. Saitama was in the helicarrier's commissary, having discovered that SHIELD provided its personnel with complimentary meals. He had eaten 2 plates of rice, a bowl of soup, and was reportedly examining the dessert options with the focused deliberation he had previously applied to instant noodles. Here's what we know, Maria Hill said, pulling up the compiled file. Saitama, Japanese national, approximately 25 years old, formerly employed in an unspecified corporate role, currently self-described as an independent hero operating out of Z City in his home dimension. No known organization, no registration, no oversight body. She paused. His power has no measurable upper limit. That's not a dramatic turn of phrase. That's a literal technical assessment. Friday and 3 separate SHIELD analysis systems all return the same result. The calculations simply don't complete. The room absorbed this. What about origin? Fury asked. Ani, how did he get here? That's where it gets complicated. Hill switched to a dimensional mapping display that showed fracture points in the space between realities, thin places where universes pressed too close together. There was an anomalous dimensional event approximately 6 hours ago. We flagged it as minor, class 3 at most, the kind of thing that usually means someone's been experimenting with unstable portals or mishandling exotic matter. She highlighted one particular fracture point above Midtown Manhattan. Best current theory is that a Hydra experiment with dimensional displacement technology, the same operation that deployed the dreadnoughts, tore open a brief corridor between this universe and his. He fell through. The corridor closed. So he's stuck here, Steve said. For now, Dr. Strange has been notified. One, he's investigating the dimensional residue. His assessment will take time. Fury set down his coffee. What's our containment posture? The question landed carefully. Tony answered it. There is no containment posture, he said flatly. That's not pessimism, that's physics. You cannot contain something that hits harder than our instruments can measure. Any facility we put him in, he walks out of. Any restraint we apply, he removes. Not aggressively. He'd probably apologize while doing it. But the outcome is the same. He leaned forward. The question isn't how we contain him. The question is whether we need to. He's an unregistered, enhanced individual operating without oversight in our jurisdiction, Hill said. He's also the reason Zemo's operation is currently spread across 5 blocks of 5th Avenue instead of 3 blocks of civilian casualties, Tony replied. I've run his behavioral profile 6 different ways. He's not deceptive. He's not strategic. He has no territorial impulses, no power acquisition drive, no ideological agenda. He stopped those dreadnoughts because people were getting hurt, and he was present. That's the complete list of reasons. Motive doesn't eliminate risk, Fury said. No, Steve agreed quietly, but it changes how we respond to it. Fury looked at him. You have a recommendation, Rogers? Steve was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a man who has thought something through from multiple angles and arrived at the same place each time. He's alone here, he said. He doesn't know this world. He doesn't know its geography, its politics, its threats. He has no support structure, No resources, no way home that he knows of. He paused. He's also the most powerful being we've encountered since Thanos. And right now, his only impression of us is a test facility in Brooklyn and a commissary on a flying aircraft carrier. Another pause. I'd like his impression to include someone treating him like a person. The room was quiet. You want to recruit him, Fury said. I want to not make an enemy of him through bureaucratic paranoia, Steve said. There's a difference. Fury picked his coffee back up, both hands again. Hill, what's Stark's registration read on him? Legally, where does he stand? Legally, Hill said, with the tone of a woman who has learned to find dark humor in impossible situations. He's a Japanese tourist who jaywalked into a federal incident and then didn't fill out any paperwork. From somewhere below them, through the helicarrier's reinforced floors, there came the very faint sound of a man contentedly eating dessert. It was, Fury reflected, the most unsettling sound he'd heard in recent memory. Not because it was threatening, because it wasn't. Because the most powerful thing any of them had ever encountered was sitting 3 decks below, eating what sounded like pudding with the serene unconcern of someone who had already concluded, correctly, that nothing in this building could make him do anything he didn't choose to do. That was the thing about truly absolute power. It wasn't loud, it didn't posture, it didn't need to. It just sat quietly in the commissary and asked for seconds. Anno, get him up here, Fury said finally, and somebody tell the commissary to keep the dessert line open. I have a feeling this conversation goes better if he's not hungry. The briefing room felt different with Saitama in it, not because he dominated it, not because he radiated threat or authority or the particular atmospheric pressure that powerful beings tend to generate in enclosed spaces. It felt different because he didn't do any of those things, and the absence of them in a man who could unmake the room with a casual gesture created a cognitive dissonance that nobody in the space could entirely resolve. He sat in the chair Fury indicated, folded his hands on the table, and looked around with the mild curiosity of someone attending a meeting they weren't sure they'd been correctly invited to. Fury sat across from him. Between them, mine under the table held a cup of coffee for Fury, a cup of tea that someone had thoughtfully provided for Saitama, and the full weight of a conversation that had no established protocol. I'm going to be direct with you, Fury said. Okay, Saitama said. You're the most powerful individual we've encountered in this universe's recorded history. We don't know how you got here, we don't know how to send you back, and we don't know what your presence means for the stability of our reality. Those are the 3 things keeping me up at night. He paused. I'm told you don't sleep badly regardless of circumstances. I sleep fine, Saitama confirmed. I slept fine before I was strong too. It's one of the things that didn't change. Fury studied him. In 40 years of intelligence work, he had learned to read the micro-expressions, the tells, on the careful architecture of deception that intelligent people construct around their true intentions. He looked at Saitama and found none of it. What he found instead was something rarer and, in its own way, more disorienting. A man with absolutely nothing to hide, not because he was naive, but because he genuinely had no agenda to conceal. What do you want? Fury asked. While you're here, what does a man like you want? Saitama was quiet for a moment. He turned his teacup slowly on the table, a small habitual motion. A fight, he said finally. A real one. Someone who makes me feel something. Effort, danger, the possibility that I might not win. He paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds honest, Steve said from the side of the room. I've been strong for 3 years, Saitama continued. Before that, I trained every day for 3 years because I wanted to be a hero. I wanted to protect people. I wanted to be strong enough that nothing could hurt the people near me. He looked at his hands on the table. Ordinary hands, unremarkable in every visible way. I got what I wanted. I got all of it. And then I found out that getting everything you want doesn't feel like anything. He looked up. I still want to protect people. That part didn't go away. I thought it would feel like more. The room held that carefully. Tony, who had been quiet in the corner, running silent analyses, spoke without looking up from his screens. Dr. Strange just made contact. He's at the dimensional fracture site in Midtown. It says the residual signature is, and I'm quoting, architecturally unlike anything produced by human or known alien agency, and he'd like to examine Saitama directly when convenient. A pause. He also says, and again I'm quoting, "Tell Stark I sensed his 17 simultaneous scans from 3 blocks away, and they were about as subtle as a marching band." "Tell Strange," Tony started. "I'll tell him nothing," Fury said. "Arrange the meeting." He returned his attention to Saitama. "In the meantime, I have a proposition. You want to help people. We have a structure for that. Imperfect, bureaucratic, occasionally maddening, but functional. You operate with us, inside our framework, while Strange works on your return passage. You get access to our intelligence network, our threat assessments, our resources." He paused. "We get, well, how do we get you?" "What does operating inside your framework mean?" Saitama asked. "Rules?" "Guidelines," Steve said carefully. "Firm suggestions," Tony offered. "Necessary operational parameters," Hill said, which was the most honest answer. Saitama considered this with the unhurried patience of a man who has learned that most urgency is performance. "Are there good fights here?" he asked. "Real ones?" It was Thor who answered, from the doorway where he had been standing silently with his arms folded and his ribs only partially healed, still wearing the expression of a man recalibrating something fundamental. "There is a man called Thanos," Thor said. "He has held all 6 Infinity Stones simultaneously and reshaped reality with them. He has killed half of all living things in this universe. He has faced the assembled might of every hero this world possesses and made them feel small." He paused. "He is currently rebuilding his power base somewhere beyond the edge of known space." Saitama looked at Thor with the first genuine interest he had displayed since arriving. Not excitement. It was too quiet for excitement. More like the careful attention of a man who has heard, in a crowded and noisy room, a sound that might be what he has been listening for. "Does he hit hard?" Saitama asked. "He shattered my rib cage once with a single blow while wearing the completed gauntlet," Thor said, "and I survived it, which I mention only because most things do not." Saitama nodded slowly. "Okay," he said to Fury. "I'll work with you, for now." He picked up his tea. "But I want to meet the sorcerer, Strange." "Why?" Fury asked. "Henry, because I want to know if I can get home," Saitama said simply. "And also because someone called Thanos who can reshape reality sounds like he might actually make me try." He drank his tea. "It's been 3 years since I had to try." Outside the helicarrier's reinforced windows, Manhattan stretched in every direction, gleaming and scarred in equal measure. A city that had absorbed catastrophes and rebuilt itself so many times it had stopped counting. Somewhere in that city, in a sanctum on Bleecker Street, a man in a red cloak had just finished examining a dimensional fracture and was standing very still, looking at the residual energy signature with an expression nobody ever saw on Stephen Strange's face. Concern, genuine, unguarded concern, because the fracture hadn't been created by Hydra's dimensional experiment. The Hydra's experiment had been the trigger, not the cause. The corridor between universes had been opened from the other side. Something had sent Saitama here, and whatever it had been deliberate. Madripoor did not care about heroes. This was not cynicism. It was municipal policy, enforced through decades of deliberate institutional corruption and the careful cultivation of an environment where power expressed itself honestly, meaning without pretense, without the polite fiction of justice, without the Avengers' particular brand of idealism touching down and rearranging things according to someone else's moral geography. Madripoor was a city that had looked at the world's various attempts at righteousness and concluded, collectively, that it preferred to handle its own affairs. It had not, in its long and complicated history, encountered anything quite like Saitama. He had arrived by commercial ferry, which was the detail that the X-Men's intelligence report would later find most confusing. Not a Quinjet, not a dimensional breach, not a rooftop approach from a SHIELD extraction point. A ferry. He had paid for the ticket with emergency funds Tony had provided, eaten a sandwich purchased from a dockside vendor, and walked into Lowtown with the unhurried bearing of a tourist who had misread his itinerary. He was not on a mission. That was the other confusing detail. Strange's examination of the dimensional fracture had produced a revelation that required digestion. The news that his arrival was deliberate, engineered by something with the capability to open corridors between universes, had landed with the weight of an entirely new category of problem. Fury had responded by scheduling briefings. Tony had responded by scheduling more analyses. Steve had responded by suggesting Saitama be given time to process. Saitama had responded by taking a ferry to Madripoor because Thor had mentioned, in passing, that it was where the world's more interesting criminals operated. And interesting in Saitama's current vocabulary was the most valuable word in any language. He found the first operation by accident. The warehouse district of Lowtown operated on a simple economic principle. If you moved quickly and paid the right people, you could ship anything through Madripoor's port without documentation, inspection, or inconvenient questions about origin or destination. The Thieves Guild had been running a weapons distribution network through 3 specific warehouses for 11 months. The X-Men had been mapping it for 9 of those 11 months, building a case with the careful patience of people who understood that dismantling networks required evidence, not just action. Saitama walked past Warehouse 7 because it was between him and a noodle restaurant he had identified from the ferry. The men who came out of the warehouse door and told him to keep walking and forget he'd seen anything were, in the grand scheme of Madripoor's criminal ecosystem, relatively junior. They had weapons. They had numbers. They had the specific confidence of people accustomed to operating in a city where those 2 things were sufficient. They had a brief and educational conversation with the consequences of being wrong about sufficiency. Saitama didn't hit any of them. He didn't need to. But he looked at the weapons they pointed at him with the mild assessment of a man examining a menu in a language he doesn't speak. And something in that look, the absolute architectural absence of fear, the vacancy where threat response should have been, produced in the men holding the weapons a reaction that was entirely involuntary and thoroughly practical. They stepped aside. 3 of them put their weapons down. One of them, later and privately, would describe the experience as looking into something that looked back from a very long way away. Saitama walked past them and into the warehouse to see what was inside. What was inside was enough weaponry to arm a small army, a sophisticated distribution network, and 47 crates of materials that would later be identified as components for Sentinel technology. The specific kind designed not for mutant detection, but for mutant elimination. He was examining a crate with the focused attention he brought to grocery labels when the X-Men came through the roof. There were 4 of them. Wolverine first, because Wolverine was always first through any entry point that involved structural damage, claws out, landing in a crouch with the fluid economy of a man whose body has learned to treat combat as its natural resting state. Storm descended through the hole in the roof on a column of controlled wind. Cyclops came through a side entrance with the precise timing of a man who has run enough operations to understand that simultaneous entry is a statement. Nightcrawler appeared beside Saitama in a flash of brimstone and smoke, having teleported from the roof to the interior in the half-second between Storm's entry and the sound of the wind reaching the floor. "Don't move," Nightcrawler said, which was the standard thing to say. Saitama looked at him. "I wasn't moving," he said. "Don't—" "Yes, good. Stay that way." Nightcrawler looked at the unconscious and thoroughly demoralized weapons dealers arranged near the entrance, then at Saitama, then at Wolverine, who had already begun processing the scene with the rapid environmental analysis of someone whose threat assessment systems run on instinct rather than computation. Wolverine's nostrils flared. He straightened slowly from his crouch. In Logan's considerable experience, dangerous things smelled dangerous. A combination of adrenaline, aggression, the specific chemical signature of predatory intent. Saitama smelled like fairy food and mild curiosity, which was, Wolverine had learned over a very long life, occasionally the most dangerous smell of all. "Who are you?" Cyclops said, from the entrance, visor trained on Saitama, with the controlled tension of a man who has learned that unknown variables in operational theaters are problems until proven otherwise. "Saitama, what are you doing in this warehouse?" It was between me and a noodle place. He looked at Cyclops with honest, uncomplicated eyes. "What are Sentinels for?" The question recontextualized the room. Storm descended fully to the floor. Cyclops lowered his angle slightly. Not his guard, but his angle. Wolverine walked slowly toward the crates, sniffed one, and his jaw tightened with the specific compression of a man receiving confirmation of something he'd hoped was wrong. Mutant elimination, Storm said quietly. Her voice carried the precise weight of someone for whom this was not an abstract policy discussion. Saitama looked at the crates, then at the four people in front of him. He did the quiet arithmetic of the situation. Who these people were, what this technology was for, what it meant that enough of it to fill a warehouse had been moving through this port without anyone stopping it. That's bad, he said. Yes, Storm said. Do you want help moving it? He looked around the warehouse. I can carry a lot. Wolverine stared at him for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Something rougher and more reluctant than a laugh. When the sound a man makes when the universe delivers an absurdity too complete to ignore. Scott, he said without looking away from Saitama, I think we need to make a call. To whom? Cyclops said. To whoever's currently responsible for the bald guy, Logan said. Because either he's the most convincing idiot I've ever met, or he's something else entirely. And my gut says it's the second one, and my gut has been right about these things for 150 years. Outside, Madripoor's night pressed against the warehouse walls, indifferent and permanent. And somewhere above the city, in the thin dark between stars, something that had opened a corridor between universes, watched with the patient attention of an entity for whom time was a preference rather than a constraint, and adjusted its calculations accordingly. Thanos knew about Saitama before the Avengers finished their second briefing. This was not surveillance in any conventional sense. Thanos did not maintain spy networks or intercept communications, or rely on the mundane architecture of intelligence gathering that lesser beings used to understand their worlds. What Thanos possessed was something older and more precise, a sensitivity to power, cultivated across centuries of study and conquest, that registered significant force the way a seismograph registers distant earthquakes. Not the location immediately, not the nature, but the fact of it undeniable, like a new star appearing in a sky he had memorized. He had felt Saitama's punch from beyond the edge of the solar system. Not the punch itself, the shock wave of it, the ripple it sent through the fundamental fabric of physical law, the way reality briefly noticed that something had occurred which its existing parameters didn't adequately describe. Thanos had felt that quality of disruption exactly twice before in his long life. Once when the first Infinity Stone was used in his presence. Once when he had completed the gauntlet and felt the weight of everything becoming possible. He sat in the silence of his rebuilt sanctuary, a structure carved from asteroid rock at the system's edge, spare and deliberate, the dwelling of a man who has concluded that comfort is a distraction from clarity, and he thought about what it meant. The Black Order arrived when summoned, as they always did, with the efficiency of beings who understood that Thanos' time was not a resource to be wasted. Proxima Midnight, Corvus Glaive, Ebony Maw, whose particular gift was words arranged into weapons. They stood before him in the asteroid's main chamber and received his assessment in the silence he used instead of preamble. There is a being on Earth, Thanos said. He arrived recently. He is not from this universe. A pause measured in the specific currency of absolute authority. He hit something, and reality noticed. Ebony Maw's expression shifted with the delicate precision of a man whose face is his most sophisticated instrument. You wish him retrieved? Studied? Eliminated? I wish him understood, Thanos said. Those are different things. Elimination is available at any moment. Understanding requires patience and intelligence, neither of which should be wasted on premature action. He stood, and the chamber recalibrated around him the way spaces do when something very large moves through them. Send no one yet. Observe only. I want to know what he wants, what he fears, and what he loves. A pause. Everything surrenders to the right pressure. The question is always where to apply it. Doctor Strange had been awake for 31 hours. This was not unusual for him. Sleeplessness was an occupational condition for the Sorcerer Supreme, who had learned early that the threats requiring his attention operated on schedules indifferent to human biology. What was unusual was the specific quality of his wakefulness, the focused alarm that had replaced his normal state of managed vigilance. He stood in the sanctum's main study surrounded by texts that predated human civilization, and a dimensional mapping array of his own construction, and he looked at the evidence of what had brought Saitama here with the expression of a man who has solved a problem and found the solution considerably worse than the problem. Saitama sat across from him, eating from a container of leftover rice someone in the sanctum had provided, watching Strange with the patient attention of a man who has learned that powerful people often need time to organize what they're about to say. Wong stood in the corner, arms folded, maintaining the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment. The corridor that brought you here, Strange said finally, was not created by Hydra's dimensional experiment. Their technology was the equivalent of, imagine someone knocking on a door that is already opening from the other side. They provided the noise. Something else provided the motion. You said this before, Saitama said. Someone sent me here deliberately. Yes, but I've now identified the signature more precisely. Strange turned the dimensional map towards Saitama. A crystalline display of fracture patterns, energy residuals, the architectural evidence of how the corridor had been constructed. This was built from the outside, from beyond this universe's boundaries, and the methodology, the specific way it was assembled, matches no human, alien, or magical agency I can identify. He paused. It matches something older. So something that operates on the level of universal mechanics rather than power within a universe. Someone who can move between universes, Saitama said. Someone for whom universes are the unit of measurement. Yes. Strange looked at him carefully. In our cosmology, there are beings called celestials, entities that predate civilizations, that shape the fundamental conditions of life across the universe. There are the beyonders, who exist outside conventional reality. There is the living tribunal, who maintains balance across the multiverse. He paused. And there are things we don't have names for yet, which is always the most concerning category. Saitama had finished his rice. He set the container down with the neat economy of someone raised to be tidy. Why me? He asked. Why bring me here specifically? That, Strange said, is what I've been awake for 31 hours trying to determine. He looked at the map. The most coherent theory I have is also the most uncomfortable one. He met Saitama's eyes, those ordinary, unremarkable eyes that contain nothing identifiable, and somehow, because of that, everything. Something is coming, something significant enough that it required you, specifically. Not an army, not the Infinity Stones, not the assembled power of every hero on Earth. He paused. You. The sanctum was quiet around them. Outside on Bleecker Street, New York conducted its ordinary evening, indifferent to the conversation occurring above it. Thanos, Saitama said. Possibly, probably, but the scale of preparation, Strange stopped, reorganized. Thanos is formidable beyond almost any measure this universe provides. But whatever opened that corridor was operating at a scale that makes Thanos look like a local concern. He said it plainly, without drama, which made it considerably worse. I think Thanos may be the opening move, not the endgame. Saitama was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Strange had not expected, delivered in the same mild, unvarnished tone he applied to everything. Good. Strange blinked. Good. If it's small, I fix it in one punch and it's over and nothing changes. Saitama looked at his hands on the table. Those ordinary, impossible hands. If it's big enough that someone went to the trouble of pulling me out of my universe to deal with it. He paused. Maybe I have to actually try. Something shifted in Strange's expression. Not surprise exactly. The more complex response of a man who has spent considerable time in the presence of heroism in its various forms, the performed kind, the desperate kind, the principled kind, and has just encountered a variety he didn't have a category for. Simple heroism. Heroism without architecture, without ideology or trauma or the weight of identity. Just a man who wanted a real fight and had quietly, almost accidentally, decided that protecting people was the thing he was for. Then I suggest, Strange said carefully, that you prepare for the possibility of trying. From somewhere beyond the solar system's edge, in a chamber carved from asteroid rock, Thanos received his observer's first report and read it twice. Then he set it down and looked out at the stars with an expression that was not quite what anyone would have expected. In it was anticipation. The Black Order came on a Thursday. There was no particular cosmic significance to Thursday. It was simply the day Ebony Maw determined that sufficient observation had occurred, that the data was adequate, and that further patience served diminishing analytical returns. He had watched Saitama for 6 days through instruments so sophisticated they bordered on philosophical, sensors that measured not just physical parameters, but behavioral patterns, decision architectures, the specific geometry of how a being moved through the world when it believed itself unobserved. What he had compiled was, by any conventional metric, deeply insufficient. Saitama had no patterns, no routines that suggested strategic thinking, no territorial behavior, no threat assessment habits. He wandered with the organic unpredictability of a man following genuine curiosity rather than plan. The Madripoor Warehouse, the Sanctum, a diner in Brooklyn where he ate 3 breakfasts consecutively, a rooftop in Queens where Spider-Man had apparently introduced him to the view, and where he had sat for 2 hours looking at the city with an expression Maw's instruments could not classify. Not tactical assessment, not the hunger of conquest, something quieter. Something that, in a lesser being, Maw might have called contentment, though the word felt architecturally wrong for what the sensors returned. He had filed his report to Thanos with the professional honesty of a man who understood that inaccurate intelligence was worse than no intelligence. The subject is anomalous. Conventional pressure points are not apparent. Or recommend direct engagement rather than continued observation. Thanos had agreed, which was how Ebony Maw found himself descending through Earth's atmosphere on a Thursday afternoon with Proxima Midnight in Corvus Glaive, while somewhere below them the subject in question was, according to last available data, eating a late lunch. The attack on Stark Tower was not subtle. Subtlety was not the Black Order's primary register. What they brought instead was overwhelming force delivered with precise coordination. The specific combination that had neutralized resistance across dozens of worlds. Proxima Midnight hit the tower's upper floors with a strike that sheared through 3 levels of Tony's best armor-grade construction, where Corvus Glaive disabled the building's power grid with a single precise cut that his glaive made through the main conduit as though the reinforced casing were suggestions. Ebony Maw descended into the wreckage with his hands clasped behind his back and his voice already prepared, because Maw's weapon was always words and he preferred to have them ready. The Avengers responded in 90 seconds, which was excellent by any standard. Iron Man from the workshop, Steve from the training floor, Thor from the roof where he had been sitting in the particular way as Guardians sit when they are thinking about things too large for rooms, Spider-Man from 3 blocks away, having sensed the attack through the specific quality of New York's ambient chaos that he had learned to read like weather. They were not enough, not immediately. Proxima Midnight engaged Thor with the ferocious efficiency of someone who had studied his fighting style from records of previous encounters, and Thor, ribs not entirely healed from the facility in Brooklyn, fought brilliantly and was losing. Corvus Glaive met Steve's shield with his glaive in an exchange that produced sparks visible from street level and drove Steve backward through a wall. Iron Man's repulsors hit Maw and dispersed around him like water around a stone, Maw's telekinetic field redirecting the energy with contemptuous ease. Maw smiled at Tony through the dispersing light. "The Sorcerer Supreme told you something was coming," he said pleasantly. He was correct, but he misidentified the sequence. Thanos does not come for the planet, he comes for the anomaly. A pause for effect, which Maw always allowed because effect was part of the weapon. "Surrender the man called Saitama to us, and Earth continues its unremarkable existence unmolested. Refuse," he gestured at the structural damage around them, with elegant economy. "We have time." Tony's armor ran 17 threat assessments and returned the same answer for all 17. "Friday," he said quietly. "Where is Saitama?" "Still at the diner, boss. He ordered dessert approximately 4 minutes ago." "Get him here." "I've been trying." He left his communicator on the table. Saitama walked into the remains of Stark Tower's lower entrance 11 minutes later, having run from the diner when a passerby mentioned the building on fire was the one with the big A on it. He was still holding a fork. He had not quite finished his dessert, and this had produced in him the specific low-grade irritation that minor inconveniences generated. The same irritation, indistinguishable in intensity, that he felt toward mosquitoes and poorly timed traffic signals. The scene he walked into was Thor on one knee, bleeding, still swinging. Steve unconscious against a collapsed wall. Tony's armor running on emergency power, 3 systems offline, maintaining a defensive position through sheer bloody-mindedness. Spider-Man webbing Corvus Glaive from multiple angles with the frantic creativity of someone who has run out of good ideas and is now executing bad ones very quickly. Ebony Maw stood in the center of it, unhurried, and turned to face the new arrival. He had prepared words for this moment. Maw always prepared words. He had constructed 3 separate opening addresses, depending on how Saitama arrived, running, flying, or transported, and had refined them during the descent through Earth's atmosphere. They were good words, precise, psychologically calibrated, designed to establish Thanos' authority while leaving Saitama a face-saving path to compliance. He looked at Saitama. Saitama looked back at him, holding a fork, with the expression of a man who has come home to find someone has rearranged his furniture. Maw deployed his words. You have been brought to this universe for a purpose that transcends your understanding. The one called Thanos has identified you as, Did you hurt them? Saitama said. He was looking at Thor. Maw paused. This was not a scheduled interruption. Oh. The injuries sustained by Earth's defenders are... Yes or no, Saitama said. The room absorbed the quality of his voice. Not loud, not threatening in any register that Maw's considerable experience with threats could identify. Simply a question that had decided it was the only thing currently happening. They resisted, Maw said carefully. Saitama set the fork down on a piece of rubble. He looked at Proxima Midnight, who had stopped engaging Thor and was watching the new variable with the professional assessment of someone recalibrating. He looked at Corvus Glaive, suspended in Spider-Man's webs, who had gone very still. He looked at Maw. I'll go, he said. To Thanos. I'll go myself. He paused. But not with you. Tell him to come here. Maw blinked. In decades of service to Thanos, across dozens of worlds and hundreds of negotiations, nobody had ever counter-proposed the terms of their own acquisition. It was not a category his preparation had included. You are not, he said slowly, in a position to dictate. I'm not dictating, Saitama said. He looked at Maw with those empty, ordinary eyes. I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to leave these people alone. You're going to go back and tell Thanos where I am. And he's going to come here, because... A pause. Something moved in his expression. Something small and careful, and almost imperceptible, like light changing in a room with very good curtains. Because if he's what everyone says he is, he'll want to come himself. Maw stood very still. And if he doesn't come, Saitama continued, still mild, still even, still holding absolutely nothing back because holding back implied there was something to hold. Then I'll go find him, either way. He looked at Thor, still on one knee and bleeding, but watching with eyes that had gone very bright. But first you're going to let me make sure my friends are okay. The word landed in the room with unexpected weight. Friends. Said without self-consciousness or performance. A simple categorization, offered plainly, that somehow recontextualized everything around it. Proxima Midnight looked at Corvus Glaive. Something passed between them. The silent communication of people who have fought together long enough to share a language of glances. Ebony Maw unclenched his hands from behind his back. He looked at Saitama for a long moment with the expression of a man filing something carefully away. Then he said, Thanos will receive your message. They left the way they came, through the damaged roof, and into the sky, gone with the efficiency of beings who understand that retreat is not defeat when the information gathered justifies the withdrawal. Tony's armor powered down one failing system to preserve another. Steve was already regaining consciousness, which was its own kind of miracle. Spider-Man descended from the ceiling and stood beside Saitama and said very quietly, Did you just summon Thanos? I invited him, Saitama said, already moving toward Thor. It's different. How is that different? Saitama crouched beside Thor and looked at his injuries with the focused attention he brought to things that mattered. Because he'll choose to come, he said, and that means he wants the fight as much as I do. He looked up at Spider-Man with those plain, honest eyes. That's the only kind worth having. Thanos came on a Sunday, and he came alone, which was the detail that rewrote every threat assessment SHIELD had prepared. Fury had spent 3 days constructing contingencies, evacuation protocols, defensive perimeters, coordinated Avenger response formations, backup plans for the backup plans. He had contacted every enhanced individual with a communicator and several without. He had pulled in favors from organizations he preferred not to acknowledge publicly. He had prepared, with the exhaustive thoroughness of a man who understood that preparation was the only honest response to overwhelming force, for an assault. Thanos arrived in Central Park at 7 in the morning and sat down on a bench. He was not wearing the gauntlet. This was the second detail that rewrote everything. He was not armored in the full regalia of conquest. He wore what he wore when he was being honest about what he was, which was enormous and purple and ancient in the specific way that things are ancient when they have survived everything that should have killed them. He sat on the bench with his hands on his knees and looked at the park's morning geometry, joggers, dogs, the particular quality of early light through leaves, with an expression that was not quite peace and not quite patience, but lived somewhere in the neighborhood of both. The Avengers held their perimeter at 300 meters. Tony in full armor, every system live. Thor with Mjolnir crackling. Strange with the Eye of Agamotto open and the Cloak of Levitation alert. The X-Men on the park's eastern edge, Cyclops' visor charged. Every enhanced individual Fury had contacted, positioned, and ready, aid watching a man sit on a bench. Saitama walked across the park alone. This had been his condition, stated plainly to Fury the previous evening, with the uncomplicated firmness of someone who has decided what they are going to do, and is explaining it as a courtesy rather than a negotiation. I'll meet him first, alone. If it goes badly, you'll know immediately. Fury had argued, Steve had argued more thoughtfully. Strange had made a case that was philosophically sophisticated and ultimately ignored. Tony had run the numbers, found them unfavorable, and argued loudest of all. Saitama had listened to all of it with genuine respect, and then done what he'd said he was going to do. He sat down on the bench beside Thanos. The bench, rated for ordinary park usage, made a sound of structural reconsideration but held. They sat for a moment in the manner of two people who have arranged a meeting and are deciding simultaneously who speaks first. "You're smaller than I expected," Thanos said. His voice was what it always was, deep and measured, the voice of a being for whom volume had never been necessary, because the weight of what he said did the work volume was usually asked to do. "Everyone says that," Saitama said. "Maw's report described you as unremarkable." "I am unremarkable." Thanos looked at him with the focused attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him, which were rare enough that the attention itself was significant. "The force you produced when you struck those machines," he said. "I felt it from beyond the solar system. I have held all 6 Infinity Stones simultaneously. I have felt the weight of reality bending to my will, and I felt your punch," a pause, "from beyond the solar system." Saitama said. "You're not going to explain it." "I trained hard," Saitama said. "I don't have a better explanation than that." Thanos was quiet for a moment. Around them, the park continued its morning. Dogs indifferent to the apocalyptic weight of the conversation occurring on the bench. Joggers routing around two figures without quite understanding why. "I have spent my life studying power," Thanos said. "Its nature, its limits, its proper application. I concluded after considerable evidence that the universe's fundamental problem was scarcity, that life, unchecked, consumed itself toward extinction, and that the only merciful solution was reduction." He paused. "I was wrong about the solution. The logic was sound, but the conclusion was monstrous, and I have had time to understand the difference." Saitama looked at him. "You killed half of everything." "Yes. And now you think you were wrong." "I know I was wrong. Knowing and having undone it are different things." Thanos met his eyes. Those plain, empty, bottomless eyes. "I came here because Maw's report said something I have never read in any report about any being in my long experience. He said you have no fear. Not suppressed fear, not managed fear, not the performed fearlessness of warriors who have trained themselves past it. He paused. Absent fear, completely, as though the architecture for it was never installed. Things stopped being scary when I got strong, Saitama said. Woody, I thought that would feel better than it does. Thanos looked at him for a long moment with an expression that crossed the vast distance between their experiences and found on the other side something unexpected. Recognition. I know what it is, Thanos said quietly, to achieve what you pursued and discover the achievement hollow. To stand at the completion of everything you worked for and find that completion is its own kind of emptiness. He paused. It is the loneliest feeling in any universe. Saitama said nothing, but something in his posture shifted, a small, involuntary adjustment, the physical equivalent of a word acknowledged. I didn't come to fight you, Thanos said. I know, Saitama said. You came to see if I was real. Yes. Am I what you expected? Thanos considered this with the honest deliberation he brought to questions that deserved it. You are exactly what I feared you might be, he said, which is not a threat. It is an answer to a question I have carried for a very long time. He looked at his hands, enormous hands, hands that had held the weight of the universe's reordering. Is there a being whose power has no ceiling? And if so, what does that being do with it? Does it conquer? Does it consume? Does it become what power always becomes when it has no check? I buy groceries, Saitama said, and I stop bad things when I see them. That's mostly it. Something happened in Thanos' expression that very few beings across very many universes had ever produced there. It was brief and genuine and surprised him, and which was rarer still. He almost smiled. Then you are, he said slowly, the most dangerous thing I have ever encountered. Not because of your strength. He stood from the bench, which exhaled with structural relief. Because your strength has not changed you, and that means it is actually yours. He looked down at Saitama, still seated, still mild, still finishing the coffee he'd brought from a deli 2 blocks away. Every powerful being I have known has been shaped by their power, defined by it, consumed by it eventually, or twisted, or elevated beyond recognition. A pause. You are unchanged. You were a man who wanted to be a hero. You became strong enough to unmake planets. And you are still a man who wants to be a hero. He said it with the tone of someone describing a phenomenon outside their taxonomy. How is that strange? Saitama asked. It is the strangest thing I have encountered in 4 centuries of existence, Thanos said, and I have encountered the Beyonders. He turned to leave, and stopped, because Saitama had stood, and there was something different in how he stood. Not aggressive, not threatening, but present in a way he hadn't been on the bench, with a quality of focus that the park's ambient morning suddenly organized itself around. You said something is coming, Saitama said. Something bigger than you. Strange thinks someone brought me here for a reason. He looked at Thanos with those plain eyes. Do you know what it is? The pause that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. There is an entity, Thanos said carefully, that exists at the boundary between universes. Not within any universe, between them. Only it has been observing the multiverse's various experiments in power and heroism for longer than human civilization has had language. He paused. It has grown, dissatisfied, with the outcomes, with what power produces in beings who possess it. Another pause, heavier. It has been collecting variables, anomalies, beings who do not fit the patterns power usually creates. He met Saitama's eyes. I believe you are the most recent addition to that collection. It brought me here. I believe so. Why here specifically? Why this universe? Thanos looked at the park around them, at the distant perimeter of assembled heroes, the morning light, the dogs, the joggers, the magnificent ordinary resilience of a city that had survived more apocalypses than any city should have to, and kept setting up coffee carts on the corner. Because this universe has something yours apparently does not, he said. It has people who have held absolute power and chosen not to use it absolutely. It has beings who became gods and remain human. He paused. It has, in other words, the largest sample of evidence that power need not corrupt. And I believe whatever is coming intends to disprove that evidence. Definitively. Finally. He looked at Saitama. It wants to show that everything, everyone, eventually breaks, eventually becomes what power makes of things. Saitama was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like something that wants a fight." "Yes," Thanos said. "Good," Saitama said, and meant it in the way he always meant it. Clean, uncomplicated, without the performance of bravado or the weight of fear. Just a man who had been looking for something real, being told that something real was coming, and feeling for the first time in 3 years the distant, wonderful, terrifying possibility of an honest challenge. Behind them on the perimeter, Tony Stark watched his sensors and said very quietly to no one in particular, "Did Saitama just make friends with Thanos?" "It appears so," Strange said beside him, looking at the two figures in the park with an expression caught between relief and the particular academic excitement of a man watching history organize itself into something he'll need to write down. "That's either the best thing that's happened this week," Tony said, "or the worst." "Yes," Strange agreed. "One of those." The entity had no name that human language could hold comfortably. Numbers Strange had found references to it in texts so old they predated the concept of writing. Impressions pressed into clay by hands that had seen something at the edge of everything and tried, with the tools available to them, to describe what looking at the boundary between universes felt like. The descriptions were consistent across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, which was the detail that had kept Strange awake for 2 more nights after Thanos' visit. Consistency across independent sources was, in the architecture of mystical research, the closest thing to proof that existed. They called it the witness, the unmoved, the one who waits between. It had been watching the multiverse the way a scientist watches an experiment, with detached, meticulous attention, cataloging outcomes, when measuring the distance between what power promised and what power produced. It had watched civilizations rise and concluded that their heroes were temporary. It had watched gods fall and concluded that godhood was a disease with a predictable progression. It had watched the Marvel Universe specifically, this universe of assembled Avengers and mutant outcasts and cosmic abstracts and street-level vigilantes, and determined that it represented the multiverse's most sophisticated argument against its conclusion. It had decided to end the argument. The incursion began at dawn on a Wednesday, which was, like Thursday, cosmologically arbitrary and somehow made it worse. It began not with invasion, but with unraveling. The specific kind of structural failure that occurs when something fundamentally outside a universe's physics makes contact with that universe's physics, and the two sets of rules attempt to occupy the same space. The sky above New York developed a quality that nobody had words for, a transparency that suggested the sky was a surface, and something was pressing against it from the other side. Strange felt it first. Then the Scarlet Witch, 3 states away, sat up from sleep with her hands already moving. Then every mystic, every cosmically attuned being, every individual whose power touched the fundamental fabric of reality, they all felt the same thing simultaneously. The universe noticing something at its edge. Saitama felt nothing. He was eating breakfast. He was eating breakfast when Tony's emergency channel opened. He was finishing it when Strange's portal appeared in the diner. He stepped through with his bowl still in hand and emerged onto the roof of the sanctum into a morning that had developed the wrong kind of silence. Not the post-catastrophe silence he had walked into on his first day here, but something anterior to that, the silence before the silence, the held breath before the held breath. The assembled response was extraordinary by any measure. Avengers on the sanctum roof and the surrounding blocks. X-Men positioned across the skyline. Thanos, and this was the detail that silenced the assembled heroes when he arrived. The detail that communicated scale more effectively than any briefing. Thanos, who had come when Strange's message reached him, who stood on the roof's edge and looked at the transparent quality developing in the sky with an expression of focused gravity. When Thanos looked at something with focused gravity, the calculus of the situation changed. "It's testing the boundary," Strange said. His hands were already moving through gestures that rewrote local reality, reinforcing the membrane between this universe and whatever pressed against it. "It's not entering, not yet. It's looking for the weak point." "It's looking for me," Saitama said. Strange looked at him. What makes you say that? Thanos said it collected me. Variables that don't fit the pattern. He looked at the sky with the direct, undeflected attention he brought to things. It wants to show that everything breaks eventually, that power corrupts everything it touches. He paused. I'm the test case. If it can break me, if it can find the thing that turns me into what it thinks power always makes, then it wins the argument. The sky's transparency deepened. Through it, in the space between spaces, something vast and patient and very old looked back. Then don't break, Tony said, which was both the simplest and most useless advice available. I won't, Saitama said, with the flatness of a statement rather than a promise. Then after a moment, can it come here? Physically? If it finds the weak point in the boundary, yes, Strange said. My shields are... Let it in, Saitama said. The roof went very quiet. Let it in, he said again. Close the breach behind it so it can't affect anything outside this space. But let it in. He looked at Strange. It wants to test whether I break. Now so let it test. He set down his breakfast bowl on the roof's edge with the neat economy of someone who intends to come back for it. I've been in this universe for 2 weeks. I've met gods and soldiers and wizards and a man who used to want to kill half of everything and decided he was wrong. He looked at the assembled faces around him. Thor, still healing but present. Steve, shield ready. Tony's faceplate down. Spider-Man on the roof's edge. The X-Men across the skyline. Thanos, enormous and grave. I still haven't had a real fight. He looked at the sky. But I think I'm about to. Strange held his shields for 3 more seconds. The particular 3 seconds of a man weighing consequences against each other on a scale that doesn't have numbers. Then he exhaled, reorganized the geometry of his defensive working, and opened a controlled aperture in the boundary. The witness came through. It was not large in the way that Galactus was large or eternity was large, not a physical scale that overwhelmed through dimension. It was large the way silence is large. It occupied the space above the sanctum roof with the presence of something that had been waiting a very long time and had no urgency about that because time was one of the things it existed outside of. It had a shape in the same approximate way that grief has a shape. You could feel its edges without being able to describe them. It looked at Saitama. He looked back. What happened next did not involve a punch, not immediately. The witness did what it had come to do. It pressed, not physically. It pressed in the way that entities outside conventional reality press when they want to test something fundamental. It reached into the specific architecture of what Saitama was and looked for the fracture point. The place where 3 years of absolute power had quietly hollowed something out. The place where boredom had curdled into nihilism. The place where the absence of challenge had become the absence of caring. The place where a hero who could not be stopped had, somewhere beneath the surface, stopped. It looked for that place with the patient thoroughness of an entity that had found it in everything else it had ever examined, and found nothing. Not resistance, not a wall, not the suppressed fracture of something holding itself together through will. Simply nothing. No hollowness, no curdled center, no hidden nihilism beneath the boredom. A man who was bored the way a person who loves something deeply is bored when that thing is absent, not emptied by the boredom, but waiting through it, intact, for the thing to return. Saitama was, the witness discovered, with the specific quality of shock available only to things that have been certain for a very long time, actually fine. He had absolute power. He had had it for 3 years. He had found it lonely and unsatisfying, and had continued, through all of that, to be exactly what he had decided to be on the day he started training. A man who wanted to protect people, not because it was rewarded, not because it felt like anything anymore, because it was the thing he was, underneath everything, and power hadn't changed that, because power isn't actually what people are made of. The witness pressed harder, showed him the futures power usually produced, the injustice Superman, the corrupted gods, the fallen heroes of 1,000 examined universes, showed him what he could become, what he could have, what power, fully exercised without restraint, actually looked like from the outside. Saitama watched the visions with the same mild attention he brought to everything. "I know," he said, to the witness. A loud, which surprised everyone on the roof. "I know what I could do. I've always known." A pause. "I don't want it. I want a good fight and a good meal, and for people to be okay." He looked at the shape of the witness in the sky with those plain, empty, bottomless eyes. "That's it. That's the whole list." The pressure stopped. The witness remained, vast and patient and recalibrating, conducting the particular internal revision of an entity that has encountered evidence incompatible with its conclusions. It was not defeated. It was not destroyed. It was something rarer and in its own way more significant. It was wrong and old enough and honest enough to know it. Then Saitama hit it, not with everything, not with the punch he might have thrown at something deserving of everything, a measured strike, calibrated with the instinctive precision he'd developed across 3 years of trying not to destroy things he didn't mean to destroy. Enough to communicate, enough to hurt in whatever way something outside conventional reality experienced hurt. Enough to be honest. The witness came apart at the boundary it had entered through. Not destroyed, Strange would determine later, but returned. Pushed back through its own aperture into the between space it had come from, carrying with it the empirical weight of data that contradicted its fundamental premise. The sky's transparency faded. The morning returned to its ordinary quality, imperfect and scarred, and entirely, stubbornly itself. On the roof of the sanctum, nobody spoke for a moment. Then Tony's faceplate slid up, and he looked at Saitama with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance from where it started 2 weeks ago, outside a convenience store in Midtown, trying to categorize something his instruments couldn't classify. "How do you feel?" Tony asked. Saitama considered this honestly, the way he considered everything. "Okay," he said. Then after a moment, when with the careful precision of someone reporting accurately rather than well, "Better than okay." He looked at his hand, the hand that had hit the witness, still ordinary, still unremarkable. That one almost felt like something. Thor from across the roof began to laugh again, that full-chested Asgardian laugh of genuine delight. It spread in the particular way that relief spreads when it finds the right vessel across the assembled faces. Spider-Man sat down on the roof's edge and laughed until his shoulders shook. Even Strange permitted himself a brief, complicated smile. Thanos at the roof's edge looked at Saitama for a long moment with an expression that had crossed the vast distance between purple-skinned, cosmic conqueror and something more human, and found on the other side, out of the word he'd been looking for since the park bench. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Saitama picked up his breakfast bowl from where he'd left it. The rice was cold. He ate it anyway. The dimensional fracture Strange had been monitoring closed fully on a Friday morning. 18 days after Saitama had fallen through it into a universe that didn't have a category for him yet. Strange explained it plainly over tea in the sanctum. The corridor home was open, stable, and would remain so for approximately 72 hours. After that, the dimensional residue would dissipate and the passage would close. Saitama listened, nodded, and asked if he could have another cup. He spent those 72 hours doing what he'd been doing since he arrived. Moving through the city, stopping bad things when he saw them, eating at diners, or sitting on rooftops with Spider-Man watching the borough lights come on at dusk. He said goodbye to Thor with a handshake that Thor received with both hands in considerable feeling. He told Steve he thought his approach to heroism was correct, which was the highest compliment Saitama's vocabulary produced, and which Steve understood precisely. He told Tony the protein bar had been terrible, and Tony said he'd have a better one ready next time, and neither of them acknowledged what next time implied. He stepped through Strange's portal on a Sunday morning, carrying nothing, going back to a world where he was still the strongest thing in existence and still couldn't find a real fight. But the Marvel Universe remembered. In the Avengers files, in the X-Men's records, in a handwritten note in Thanos' sparse sanctuary, and in the witnesses' recalibrated understanding of what power actually does to a person who is genuinely, stubbornly, irreducibly themselves. Saitama left a mark that had nothing to do with force, and somewhere in the between spaces, something vast and patient and newly uncertain watched his passage home and continued thinking. It had more variables to examine. But this,